Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to another exciting episode of Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host, Chris Kay. Today is part 2 of our series called The 10 Most Important in Metal History. And today's subject is the 10 most important bassists in metal history.
In most cases, the bassist and the drummer form a band's awesome rhythm section. On other more rare occasions, and as is the case with some of the people we'll be discussing today, some truly amazing musicians push their instrument beyond the typical role. These bassists aren't the butt of the joke when it comes to their bands. Today we're going to discuss who we believe are the 10 most important bassists in heavy metal history.
As I mentioned previously, this is part 2 of a 5-part series. We'll be releasing the other 3 parts in the next few weeks, so you won't want to miss an episode. And you can do that by clicking subscribe, download, like, or follow on your favorite podcast platform so that you get our latest episode as soon as it drops. Chris, bassists. So we're in part 2 of this series that we've undertaken. And before we begin, I want to apologize to all of our fans out there, all of our listeners. I know that we've been taking forever in between shows. Damn it, life goes on, okay? Life has been, and I don't want to say life has been hard. You had a vacation, I had a vacation, so it was back-to-back weeks. We're still kind of in that honeymoon phase with your new promotion at work. So there's just so much going on, and sometimes we're just too damn tired to record an episode. So bear with us as we can, put this series together.
You're not wrong, and again, we do apologize, but I appreciate anybody who's hanging on there, and we'll continue to put out episodes as we're able to. So
yes, of course.
And I'm excited to get to the next couple of these too.
Oh yeah, I mean, I thought when we thought about this, I don't remember if it was your thought or my thought. We collaborated on putting this series together, and I thought it was really good because I know we got a lot of excitement when we were talking about the 10 most important bands in metal history, and I thought by breaking it down individually, it would be a good idea. And now we're getting to bassists, and bassists kind of, they're a little bit near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to explain a little bit of that later. But do you want to go first in revealing your number 10, or do you want me to go first? What do you want to do?
Well, I'll go first this week, and I think my number 10 is probably going to be a bit divisive, but I think there's a lot of merit to this guy. I am picking I'm picking Michael Peter Balzary, aka Flea, the bass guitarist from Red Hot Chili Peppers. And the reason I say he might be a controversial pick is for a couple reasons. Obviously, he's not strictly a metal bassist, and also he's a bit divisive in the way he plays. Like some bassists will say he's all flash, and I would really disagree with that. I think he's an amazing player. He brings a lot of funk into the sound that he plays, even on the more hard rock albums. And I think, to me, he's one of those that has always stood out in his playing style. I've always, I think, above all other aspects of that band, Flea is one of the things that just stands out to me. And he's been there the entire time. So the other thing is, like, he is a multi-talented guy. I mean, he's been in movies. He's been a voice actor. He does lots of other things, video games. He has contributed to others' music videos. Been on hundreds of collaborations along with Red Hot Chili Peppers music. So this guy's all the way around, like the scene. And I can't tell you that. I mean, there's so many musicians out there that talk about, like, how he's influenced him as far as, like, his slap bass. Didn't originate all of these things, but is very much in the public eye and really has just influenced a lot of people. So, it's like I said, I put him at number 10 because I knew he, at least in my opinion, couldn't go above that. But I think he's an amazing player and definitely a huge contribution to the hard rock and metal scene.
I'm a big fan of Fleas. I like the Red Hot Chili Peppers a lot. I haven't necessarily liked what they've done in the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years, somewhere around there. um, but I mean, like, look, there was a while where they didn't put out an album for a while. So, uh, but all the way up to basically Stadium Arcadium, I guess. So let's say less than 20, less 15 to 17 years or something. Maybe it is 20. I don't remember. But um, I enjoy his playing a lot, and I agree with you that he is a very, very good bass player, excellent bass player, multi-talented, like you said. I didn't think inside that particular box, so that's outside the regular box, but inside the other box, and I wasn't in that. I wasn't playing in that room.
Not that
So,
box, this box.
right. So before I reveal my number 10, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to say this. Last episode, okay, you and I had it was not a heated discussion. It was a very good debate back and forth about what I felt was the importance of Kirk Hammett versus you saying that Dave Mustaine was more important. And I this is my new phrase that I've been coming up with, and it's not new to the rest of the world, but it's something that I stand by. I'm dying on that hill. Okay, I am dying on that sword. I will take it because
You're not putting Kirk Hammett as your
no. But I'm a lot of people, like, I literally got some comments online saying that I was wrong, right? And I will stand by it every time. I broke it down even further, and I still stand by it. So anybody else want to say anything? That's fine. We'll continue the debate, but that I'm dying on that hill. Anyhow, so my number 10. So I looked at my list, and I don't think there's anything really, really controversial on my list in terms of picks, but there is, some interesting ones, I would say.
You mean
Uh,
bassists that play with a pick? Or no?
no, no. So my number 10 is Joey DeMeo from Man of War.
Interesting. Okay.
So for those people out there who are Man of War fans, you know exactly who I'm talking about. You know exactly why I'm talking about him. Joey DeMeo is an excellent bass player. Joey DeMeo is one of these people who will tell you he's an excellent bass player.
Yeah.
So, but beyond that, there is a musicality about him that definitely stands out above a lot of people. You cannot deny his talent. You cannot deny his ability. And so I've chose him at number 10 because I believe the other 9 that I have above him have a different importance. But Joey's importance to me is, he was there at the beginning of, what became the scene of heavy metal in the early 80s. Coming out of New York, 1982, the first album, Battle Hymns for Man of War. He put a song on there called William's Tale, where he played his piccolo bass at lightning speed to the William Tell Overture. And it's just amazing. And I remember listening to this as a teenager and going, holy shit, this guy's amazing. Now, as I learned more and more about the instrument, the recording process, and all the different things in between, you realize, yes, it's a very good piece of work. There are other things out there that are better. There are other players that are out there that are better, but this still stands out as something that's a signature piece. I like it much more than the stuff that he did later on a couple of albums, as these lead solo type of things, playing a million notes an hour. But that stood out to me. And other than that, everything else is really, you can you can tell, you can hear his playing. He's a person who strives on perfection. He wants the perfect sound. He wants the perfect tone. And he has this gear that he believes is perfect. And to the point where he refuses to play certain venues if they cannot provide certain things for him in order to achieve the perfect sound so that his audience can hear him and his band in perfection. I'm not fucking kidding about all this shit.
I know you're not.
This is absolutely true. I read this interview and I'm like, what am I reading here?
I think we should at some point do a episode about Manowar for sure.
We did that because we did the head-to-head on the Kings of Metal and
yeah, but I mean more of a deep dive.
Oh boy.
Or a shallow dive.
So it's a shallow dive, and hopefully my loincloth doesn't flip up when I'm on my way down. All right, so that's my number 10, Joey DeMeo.
Okay. I can see it. Yeah, he's not on my list, spoiler alert, but I think he's definitely one of the aspects of that band that stands out a lot, like you said. So, my number 9 is going to be from a band that I don't listen to a tremendous amount, but I have a large amount of respect for. That would be John Myung from Dream Theater. If you haven't listened to Dream Theater, you're in for a lot when you do.
A lot.
That being said, what I mean by that is these guys are amazing musicians. They are musicians. And while they do have some really catchy songs that kind of came around in their early career, that's not what they're about. They're about playing their instrument the very best they can. And they are about pushing their instrument to its furthest potential. Their fan base are people that really like progressive rock and metal. And that's the best I can say. Now, that being said, you listen to any of these guys in the band, past and present, and they're all masters of their instruments. And I would say John Myung is that. He has been in the band since the very beginning, one of 2 members that have been sent, the entire run. And, that's 15 studio albums and a score of others. And he's just one of those guys that really does things that you go, what the hell was that? Like that was on a bass. He switched over to a 6-string bass so he could, push things even further. And I just I'm always kind of in awe when I listen to Dream Theater. Like I said, I don't listen to him a lot of times. And some of that is the merit of I just don't enjoy the vocals that much. And it's an acquired taste. I would say James LaBrie, he is a great singer, but he's just not my taste. So I wish a lot of times I could listen to them more than I do. But yeah, just watch any video of John playing and you'll be very impressed. And the other part of that I do want to mention before I move on is just how many musicians have come behind him saying, wow, we didn't even know a bass could do the things that he does. And, one thing I think of when I think of important bassists or important musicians in general is how much they influence other people as well. It's a huge factor. So, I would say so, maybe a bit underrated. And, when you listen to bassists talk about their favorites, he's usually in the list.
He is amazing. Dream Theater, they're all amazing. I mean, that's who they are. Just 5 amazing musicians who just live in a class all by themselves, basically. And John is definitely a bassist, if you would look at it that way. You mentioned about influencing all these other people, and I've read his name several times while doing this. So, spoiler alert, he's not on my list. Not because I don't like him or anything like that. It's just that when you get into that level of bass playing or just level of musicianship, it's it's kind of weird. Like Eddie Van Halen, was musical guitar genius, but there was also the straight up rock and roller in him, where some of these guys that are in that progressive field really can't get out of that mindset because they're just, they think on a different level. A lot of these like these bands that are what they call like math metal, all the
Yeah.
rhythmic players. It's almost like they can't even think in 4/4.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's too simple. I kind of, and it's not like they're looking down on the people who do that, but it's almost like they're so used to playing so outside that box that the normal box is just very small to them. And it's not a negative against those kinds of players. It's just that that's how amazing they are. You
Hmm.
know, so someone maybe not on the same level as John, but I think this guy is pretty damn good. And actually,
It better not
you
be you.
be me. You know,
Yeah.
eh, that's a little higher on the list. No, actually, this next person you've kind of turned me on to, even though I knew who he was or is, um, from back in the day. You kind of turned me on to him, and I've become to appreciate him a lot more in recent years, and that is your friend and mine, Steve DiGiorgio. Look, I
Steve,
got his name right.
Steve DiGregorio.
Steve DiGregorio. Steve DiGiorgio. So I looked him up, I knew I was going to put him on the list, right? And so I wanted to get a little bit more about his background because I know he had done early Testament, well, not early Testament, Middle Testament. He played on more of the Deathy Testament from the 90s. Um, and I had known about him from some other bands. I knew he played with Death. Um, but I didn't really know a lot about his history and how far back he went. And so to find out, he was a founding member of the band Sadis, and not only that, but what I didn't realize is that he played with them all the way through 2016. I mean, he was there for them the entire time,
Hmm.
and now they're still together, and he's no longer playing with them, but they're kind of not really doing a lot, but they're still technically in existence. He is currently a member of Testament. This is where I kind of know him from the most. But what you kind of introduced me to, besides the fact that his name is not DiGiorgio. Uh,
It is DiGiorgio.
oh, I'm sorry. It's not. Is that I've always called him by a funky different name, DiGiorno, Di Gregorio. That was the one that you told me that wasn't his name. Um, but you made me appreciate the fact that, and I didn't even realize it because I seen him play, but it never really dawned on me that he was playing fretless bass. To the point that he's actually credited as being one of the first, if not the first, to bring fretless bass into heavy metal. And essentially, over the last several years, he's been a bassist for hire. Um, he's had a lot of different homes. I don't think he was ever a permanent member of any particular band other than Sadis until he's now become pretty much a permanent member of Testament. But he's a badass, especially with the fact that he plays a fretless bass. He actually played bass. He's the one who replaced Dave Ellefson's tracks on the Sick, the Dying, and the Dead, the latest Megadeth album. So,
And did a
um,
really good job.
he did, although we have no idea what Dave's parts were, so we don't know the comparison.
I just mean as a whole, like,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
amazing playing on that album. It's not it definitely, to me, nowhere near Dystopia, but there's still amazing playing on the album.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad to see that James Lomenzo is back in Megadeth because I knew he was a good fit when he was there the first time.
Yeah,
Um,
that's another era of the. I think a lot of times about what we want to talk about, etc. Right, and I think we need to maybe do something with some underrated eras of bands. And when I think about Megadeth, like they were on a downslide, and then Dave Ellefson leads the band. They put out 3 albums that were pretty damn good with James Lomenzo before Dave came back. And then the albums that came out when he came back were not that great. So, I mean, Dystopia is great, but it's something to think about. I think a lot of listeners forget.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. That's one of those things where you look at different eras, and I think that's now that we've talked about, that is definitely something we should talk about. The underrated eras of certain bands that have changed members and stuff like that. Whether or not that membership at that time was good, bad, or indifferent. All right, so that's my number 9, Steve DiGiorgio. So
it just makes me laugh because how many times you've called him like different things. DiGiorno obviously being one of the biggest ones, but
I just love doing that on purpose.
No, I know, and most of the time it is on purpose. But then, just like earlier, I knew his name was not Steve DiGiorgio,
but it is.
All right. I guess going to my number 8. So again, this might be a little bit of a it's debatable, right? But he has some roots in metal as well. I'm going with Les Claypool. Les Claypool is an amazing bassist. And it's weird to even like. I don't know if you can call him just a bassist, right? He is a musician. Guy does things with the bass that other people just don't do. Adds a funk element to everything. You know, he was originally like in 1986 after Cliff Burton died, he was asked to join Metallica at one point. Like he has done all kinds of things. Primus, of course, being the biggest one. Primus has done, uh, things that I would never, in my mind, think would be done with a bass, right? And so he's one of those guys that like you talk to musicians again, kind of the same thing. He's a musician's musician, and they'll be like, huge influence. I never believed like that or people could do things with their instrument like he does. Like his association with, say, Buckethead. To me, in some ways, those are like two extremely different people, but two of a kind in the same way. Like just one of those things where like pushing the limits of an instrument is what I keep kind of hitting on the head. And so like and many times I over the years I would think, well, I don't listen to a lot of his music, but every time I would just sit there kind of in awe and listen like, oh wow, damn, like this guy's amazing. And if I was more into weird stuff, I would listen to it. But that doesn't take away from my just amazement of what the guy does. I'd love to see him live.
I'm trying to think if I ever saw. I don't think I've seen Primus.
I missed them with somebody. I was supposed to go see some band, and Primus was the opening act, and I missed them for some reason or other, and I just don't even remember what it was. But
I can't remember if they were on an Ozfest or a Lollapalooza that I saw. I can't remember. I got to look it up. That one definitely escapes me. I love Les. Sailing the Seas of Cheese is my favorite album by Primus. Tommy the Cat and Jerry Was a Race Car Driver. Those two songs are so weird and so awesome. It's like if you haven't, so anyone listening, if they haven't heard Primus, there's a couple of songs that you really need to listen to. Tommy the Cat, Jerry Was a Race Car Driver, Winona's Big Brown Beaver, and My Name Is Mud. Those were pretty big hits for them. For what it's worth, they've had some more songs in between and all that stuff, but those are 4 that stand out to me. And man, is he an amazing bass player! And for those of you who have not seen it, Geddy Lee had a show. I believe it was on Netflix, or no, I think it was on
Was it
Paramount.
on? Yeah, something like
Paramount
that.
Plus. Geddy Lee had a show called Geddy Lee Asks, Are Bass Players Human Too? His guests were Les Claypool, Chris Novoselic, Melissa Ofdemar, and my number 8, Rob Trujillo. So you like that segue, huh?
Yes, I do. Very well done, sir.
So Rob Trujillo is my number 8. Rob Trujillo, for we all know, is the current bass player for Metallica. It may sound like a homer pick again, but I challenge anyone out there to tell me that Rob Trujillo is not one of the most badass bass players on the planet. Okay. He is not just a Metallica bass player. Okay. I've known about
He's a suicidal tendencies.
he's a suicidal tendencies bass player. I've known about Rob since Suicidal. Like I remember, I don't, I wasn't there reading interviews when he joined, but I remember his first album. I have it. Then his first full length album was Lights Camera Revolution. Um, you know, it, I remember all that stuff, 1990, 89, 90, 91. That was the prime time for Suicidal, because even though they started in the early 80s, there was a period of time where they were still underground, but they slowly but surely rose to prominence. And Rob Trujillo was part of that. Rob Trujillo and Mike Muir also made Infectious Grooves. Big fan of Infectious Grooves when they first came out. So then from there, because of Infectious Grooves, they had a relationship with Ozzy, because Ozzy sang on the song Therapy. Well, that led to Rob eventually joining Ozzy's band. Right? And so now you got Ozzy's band, and he's playing with Ozzy. He's playing with Zach. He's met Zach. Well, that leads to a job with playing with BLS on a few shows when they needed a fill-in bass player, and so on and so forth. Well, come 2003, Metallica needs a bass player, and he tries out. He literally. I read this or actually listened to this recently. He tried out for the band, and if anyone who's seen some kind of monster knows, Piggy from Marilyn Manson tried out. I can't remember his real name. What was his? I think Pepper Keenan tried out, and then a couple of other guys, and then there was Rob Trujillo, and Rob. They took him out. Lars took him out the night before his tryouts, I think it was, and because they all hung out, whatever, and their thing, Metallica's thing, was, can this guy drink with us? Can this guy hang with us? Well, Lars basically just drank his ass under the table. Well, the next morning they had rehearsals and they had to try out, and he didn't remember half the shit that he had to play, but he knew how to play battery, so he played a drunken battery and got the gig. So, I mean, look, Rob Trujillo, like I said, I dare anyone to sit there and tell me that he's just Metallica's bass player, because he is a badass. Um, I love the way he plays. I love the fact that he can play funk, he can play slap, he can play with his fingers, he can play with his pick, he can do pretty much just about everything behind the bass, and he knows how to keep that groove that bands, for the most part, require. So
I
he's my
would
number
agree on that.
8. Say what?
I said I would agree on that. I mean, he is a really good bass player, and I think he's my second favorite Metallica bass player. And it's no slight to Jason, um, but yeah, I think Rob is a really great fit for that band.
And,
Um,
well, sorry to interrupt you. Just my last thing on this, and I put him in as my number 8 important bass player because of the fact that he's played with Suicidal, he's played punk, he's played with Ozzy, so he's played straightforward metal, and he's played with Metallica, and they are across the gamut between thrash, and straight heavy metal. So he can do it all, and that's why I consider him one of the most important bass players out there.
okay. Well, he is not on my list, but
How dare
you know
you?
who is on my list? The bass player for a little known band called Talus, Mr. Big, and he played with David Lee Roth, Mr. Billy Sheehan. Um, Billy Sheehan has put out 478 albums in the of course, I'm joking, but this man never stops playing, and if you have seen him play, you will hope that he never does. A lot of people have called him the Eddie Van Halen of bass, and I think that's an apt name. The guy does things on the bass that are, you almost don't realize he's playing bass sometimes. Um, Absolutely amazing player, really cool guy. Um, it's so funny to me that like you look at Mr. Big and their biggest song is, at least in the U.S., is the um what is it called, "To Be With You" or something like that.
Be
That
with you.
song, yeah, right. And it doesn't reflect like anything else they do, because you know they're all like super. Again, some of these guys we're talking about today, like we talked about Dream Theater, but the guys in Mr. Big, Paul Gilbert, uh, uh, obviously Billy Sheehan, Pat Torpey. Those guys are like masters of their instruments, and I always kind of look at Eric Martin as kind of the weak link, but he's still a great player. Um, yeah, but Billy Sheehan, to me, he seems like he should be way bigger than he is. But again, he's a musician's musician. You watch anything he does, any solo things, any videos on YouTube, you can find tons of stuff, and the guy is absolutely amazing and has made a huge mark on the industry, at least within the industry. And like I keep saying in my sections of these, like I think influence is a big thing, like beyond just the spectrum of what we take in as consumers. Now that being said, like obviously the US is not the only market out there. We are from the US, so we kind of see it from our perspective here. But Mr. Big and Billy Sheehan himself, like just massive in Japan, and has influenced an entire different generation of players from a different country than we see here all the time. And so there's a lot of Japanese players and from other players from the Orient that will recognize him as a reference as well. And so for that, I think it's an interesting, like different kind of take than some of the other guys where we see it. Like obviously there's a huge like crossover between European audiences and American audiences, but less so in the, Asian to American European audience base. So kind of a different perspective. And if you haven't listened to anything from Billy Sheehan, just like Google him, play some videos on YouTube, and you'll be absolutely amazed.
Billy's my number 7.
Amazing.
So of course, growing up in New York, I heard about Talus, um, but they never really got anywhere. They never did anything major. But Billy Sheehan, just his name just kind of floated around circles if you were into music in New York. And when he joined the David Lee Roth band, I had heard about this great bass player, Billy Sheehan, and when I saw him on that video for Yankee Rose, I was blown away. I'm like, that's that dude, and he it was just freaking incredible. And then he brought with him from Talus, he brought that song Shy Boy, that basically was a tribute to Van Halen, and he's playing Eddie Van Halen type tapping parts on the bass during that song. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
makes that song. I mean, the whole song is styled after Van Halen, but it includes him and Steve Vai trading off tapping licks, which is just mind boggling. I mean, if you listen to the song, you'll know.
It's a
So,
great song.
oh,
Great album. Yeah.
it's a great album from David. It was the best that he's done. But
Agreed. I still like that Skyscraper album, but yeah,
no, it
yeah.
wasn't too bad. But the first
Not
one was
not
just
in comparison, yeah.
amazing. And so my notes on Billy is funny because you know he's known for playing lead bass. I mean, not too many people are known for that.
Right?
Um, so and then he rose to prominence, like I said, with David Lee Roth. He achieved international success with Mr. Big. I mean, they're like you said, they're huge in Japan. You know,
Mhm.
and just like other bands, the United States is not the only market. Yes, it's the biggest market, but in many cases, bands make careers elsewhere, and you don't hear about them in the United States because it's like, oh, they don't play the U.S. Why? Why would they play the U.S. if they're going to only play clubs when they can play stadiums and arenas everywhere else?
Yeah,
And
and
another
there's an aesthetic taste difference sometimes too.
true,
Yeah.
true, and another example of that is Manowar. Manowar is enormous in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, they've filled out stadiums in
They
Europe.
still do?
Probably not as big a stadium, I guess you could say,
Mhm.
but I mean, they're huge. I mean, they're mostly huge on the eastern side of Europe, but still, regardless, if you're going to go to Poland and play a stadium and you're playing the stadium, you got 30,
Yeah.
40,000
Oh,
people. Hey, shit, you got 30, 40,000 people.
yep.
You know, you they can barely sell out a ballroom in the United States, but put them in Europe, and they're a big time act. And the same thing with Mr. Big. Mr. Big was huge in Japan. Dokken was huge in Japan. David Hasselhoff was huge in Germany. We don't know why still.
Yep.
You know? but but those are the things like that.
You know who else is huge in Japan?
Who?
Shaq.
Well, he's
'Cause
just huge. Period. He's just a big man. Uh, so so I Billy Sheehan, just amazing bass player, and right now, um, his most recent project was the Winery Dogs. They're kind of put on hold for the time being because Richie Kotzen is doing some more solo stuff, and what's his face? Mike Portnoy is back in, what's his
Dream
face?
Theater. Yeah.
Mike Portnoy is back in Dream Theater, so that's taking up his priority right now. So yeah, Billy Sheehan, my number 7, your number 7, so that means you're up to number 6.
I gotta say it because you mentioned Mike Portnoy. I was listening to something the other day, and this guy kept calling him Mark Portnor or something like that, and it was driving me up a wall.
Wasn't it Portney?
But it was Mark, and he kept saying
Oh, it was
instead of
Mark? Oh
yeah.
no.
It was whoever I was listening to. This was a different conversation. You were telling me about somebody saying Portney.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, something I was watching the other day, like 2-3 days ago. This guy kept calling him Mark Portnor or something like that, and I was like, "What? Just listen to what his name is."
No, the guy that I say he kept calling him Mike Portney, and that was some dude who was trying to like he does videos on drummers. He's a drummer who
Mm,
criticizes or not criticize critiques. Let me put it that way.
critiques, yeah.
Drum videos, and I'm like, how are you a drummer and not know it's Mike Portnoy? That's what
Very.
blew my mind. Anyway,
So moving on to my number 6, it's your number 9, Steve DiGiorgio. Um, so for me, like, just huge fan of the guy. I mean, he's played in pretty much every metal band that that you probably don't know. Um, he's he's played in Death, Autopsy, Control Denied, Obscura, Iced Earth. He played with Sebastian Bach on one of his albums, Obituary, Megadeth, and like you mentioned earlier, he was the one of the founding members of Sadus.
which one
Um,
of these albums doesn't fit?
Sebastian
Sebastian
Bach.
Bach.
But that's what's so amazing about the guy is he can play any of these different styles. And yeah, he mostly sits in the range of like really heavy stuff. But what's interesting is like he got involved with Death. He was on and off a member of the band, and some of that was personal stuff, like dealing with just life. And when I watched the death documentary that came out a few years ago, he was regretful of not being able to be involved in certain things, but he was like really realistic guy. He's like, we sat around writing music, and then I had to go take care of life, and it's just really interesting to hear some of these things. But like you mentioned earlier, the guy really brought in the whole fretless bass sound into music that you hear in a lot of technical death today. I mean, a tremendous amount of technical death, and he's influenced such amazing players as like Linus Klassenitzer and Euro and Paul Thesseling, who are guys that both uh, became members of Obscura, and then later Obsidious. And it's funny, he even like played in the same band, at least for sessions and that kind of stuff too. So there's like this tight, he's part of this tight knit community of these amazing musicians, and it's really just impressive that he can go and play full time with Testament, and then go like, oh, can you sit in on Megadeth, because like we know you're one of the best players in the world, and you can just pick this up and play it. And he did in just a couple days. Amazing stuff. Always been a huge fan of his, and I always hear his name in tons and tons of videos when I listen to musicians talking about other musicians. And to me, that like carries a lot of weight. As I've said before, guys played on 50 plus albums, and that's just like as a guest. So amazing stuff. I'd love to put him higher, but I've got a few that I place a little bit higher on the scale.
Oh, I mean, like I said, I like Steve, and and it's weird. I knew who he was, but you turned me on to him more because of all the, like, since you've turned me on to a lot of more
The
deathy,
heavier stuff,
yeah, the
yeah.
heavy stuff, more death metal, more melodic death metal. His name is in those circles a lot more. So, but
Very
speaking
true.
of deathy kind of metal, extreme metal, let's talk about it that way. My number 6 bassist is Eric. Oh, excuse me. My number 6 bassist is Martin Eric Ain from Celtic Frost.
Okay.
I look at him as being important in the realm of heavy metal and basses, because you don't hear his name talked about very much in terms of influence, right? But we also don't live in Switzerland, so you don't hear it much. Um, but he actually is an American. He was born in California, moved to Switzerland, was out there during the time where extreme metal was essentially formulated in uh, that area of the world. And he had joined the band Hellhammer in late 1983. The band dissolved in 1984. They took him and Tom Warrior, or Tom Fisher, or whatever you want to call him. Um, they formed Celtic Frost in 1984. And I got to say this, when you listen to those early albums, one thing that stands out to me is the production is, I can't say it's awesome, but between the bass and drums, it's like amazing. The bass is cuts through so clearly, and that has a lot to do with the fact that there's only one guitar, one bass, one drum, and vocals. That's it. Just those 4 tracks, essentially. And the tone on the guitars is not that great, and I think that's what um, makes the bass and the drums stand out, because they got a really clear sound on that. And that bass just rattles when you listen to it. It's just amazing. And so those first couple of albums from Celtic Frost, it's really, really like the bass cuts through, and not in a twangy kind of way, in like a kind of a heart attack, rumble your bones kind of way. And he was one of the people who were influential in Celtic Frost to bands like Mayhem, and all the other Norwegian death metal bands that would come afterward. They weren't Norwegian, but they were up in the same territory, same area closely. You know, it's above the certain point in the northern hemisphere. But
Fair.
you know, but they had a huge influence. Celtic Frost had a huge influence on the Norwegian black metal scene. And according to Martin, he said that Dead from Mayhem was the first person to put on corpse paint that he knew of. But I disagree because I know that what's his face? I know
Oh,
that King Diamond was one of the early adopters of face paint way back in the day, 82, 81. I mean, hell, Melissa came out in 83, and they had released the EP in 82, so it was, it was already being used. But Dead was one of the first, he wanted to look dead. So that's what he did. But I really appreciate Martin's playing because it's so crystal clear, and it is such the, when it's just those two instruments. So you got this rhythm guitar basically because Tom doesn't really play much in terms of leads. So you got this rhythm guitar and you've got this bass that are creating this sound. To me, that's amazing, and it sounds so good.
I would agree in a lot of ways. I mean, um, especially the early era of Celtic Frost. The sound that carries through in a lot of ways. Are the rhythms, the bass lines, and then the corresponding vocal lines, etc. I mean, I really like those first couple albums.
Yeah, I mean
And
everything up to Into the Pandemonium, because after '87, it was just a joke, and it was more they kind of were forced to do stuff because their record company told them they had to, kind of thing.
yeah,
So and it was also a matter of trying to make it, but the early stuff, the EP Morbid Tales, To Make a Theron, Into the Pandemonium. To Make a Theron is an LP, Into the Pandemonium is an LP, but they also had Emperor's Return, Tragic Serenades. Those were all amazing, EPs and albums.
absolutely. So my number 5, I might have a little bit of backlash on this one as well, but gonna have to stick up for my point on it. I'm going with Bob Daisley. Probably a little bit of an underrated pick on this one. Bob Daisley, to me, when I listen to the way he plays bass and the bands that he's played with. I mean, he was with Ozzy Osbourne, Rainbow, Gary Moore. Some of the biggest names that you would think of when you talk about like early metal and hard rock. Played with Yngwie Malmsteen. Um, Played with and he's even played with Black Sabbath. Um, and so Bob, to me, and it's a tragedy. I remember, listening to the early, Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, when when Sharon decided to erase Bob from history. I thought that was absolutely disgusting, and it made me not want anything to do with Ozzy and his camp for the longest time. That being said, like you've listened to this show, you know how much I love those first 6 Black Sabbath albums. Um, it was really disheartening to hear that because I thought Bob's playing was absolutely amazing. Um, he is one of those guys that you don't hear a lot of talk about, and then when he gets brought up, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, the guy's fucking amazing." So it's always weird to me because there is this thing of like, you know, um, he's almost been erased in a lot of ways because of that witch, and you know, if you've ever listened to Uriah Heep, which I'm not sure, a lot of our listener base probably gets into Uriah Heep. There's some really interesting stuff, and I didn't really listen to them until more recent years when I came across it on a channel on YouTube. I'm trying to remember the name at the moment. Um, but I watched a video talking about, some of their really bizarre antics and playing styles and things that and elements that were brought into the music, and I was really impressed. And so for me, when I listen to Gary Moore, obviously the most of his music is the focus is his guitar playing, but then always in the background is this, you know, fantastic bass playing. Everybody that I mean, when you have a musician of that caliber, they're going to surround themselves with the best of the best. And so like I think a lot of times he's just not brought up, but I think he's got to be at least in the top 15, top 20 for most people, whether they know it or not.
It's funny because I had Bob Daisley on my top 10 and I
Mhm.
took him out because I realized that I felt there were others because I was trying to think, what's the biggest importance besides Ozzy for Bob Daisley,
Yeah.
and it was, I mean, that's probably the hugest, biggest, most ginormous influence and importance is because he played on those two classic albums, and more. Actually, he played on a
He
lot of
played on
Ozzy albums.
Yeah, he played on No Rest for the Wicked, and he played on No More Tears, which is one of Ozzy's biggest albums also.
It's
So
not
and
just that, like, he played on Blizzard, Diary, Bark at
Bark
the
at the Moon.
Moon, Ultimate Sin. He was on Tribute, in but
Yeah, but that's all back
right.
material.
That's live. That's live. No Rest for the Wicked. No More Tears. So he was on every album
And
for
that's
Ozzy.
why I'm saying he's underrated because a lot of times people don't think about it. I mean, he was on Long Live Rock and Roll, which is arguably Rainbow's biggest album, at least from that era, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, he played with Gary Moore, and Gary Moore is weird because I'm not really into a lot of blues, but I've always liked Gary Moore and his playing style. And I think again, this is another like taste thing. Like he's not as big in the US. So, it's a different perspective that you got to keep in mind in there. And then Bob is still around playing,
Oh
at
yeah.
74. So,
And
I mean,
let me make a correction. Bob did not play on the Ultimate Sin, but he did co-write many of the songs on that. So that's
oh,
the
okay.
so it was Phil Soussan who played bass on the Ultimate Sin, who, by the way, for the longest time had a legal battle with the Shot in the Dark song because that's his song, you know, and he didn't get a lot of credit, a lot of the credit for that song
What,
until
what? Ozzy not giving credit for.
yeah, it's kind of weird.
I mean,
So
I think Ozzy just got a big head after he wrote all of the songs on
all of
Bark.
I'm barking to ongoing joke. So speaking of the whole thing, my number 8 guy, Rob Trujillo, was the unfortunate participant in the replacing of Bob Daisley's bass on Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, the way I look at that is somebody was going to do it, right? And you can't fault the musicians involved. Like, you really can't.
well, at the time, Mike Borden from Faith No More and Rob Trujillo were basically like a tag team. They they were in Ozzy's band, but like they were like rhythm section for hire
Yeah.
for a while, and you can't blame them for it's like you said. And I think Mike is the one who said it. Somebody was going to do it, so why not me get paid, kind of thing, And so it's also one of those things where it's like it's hard, when you're in the circle, it's hard to say no to Sharon because you'll never be in the circle again, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but rightfully so, Ozzy had it corrected. Uh, and I actually, I went out of my way to find those albums much later on, just so I could say I have them. So I have Blizzard and Diary with Rob and Mike Borden on it. It just doesn't sound the same. but
No, it
but I
doesn't.
mean, I respect Bob Daisley a lot, and I was going to put him on. I mean, he has some really like the bass line to "I Don't Know" is really cool. Like I listened to it and I'm like, I didn't expect it to be that way. I thought it was different. And then it actually has something going on with it that you're kind of like, oh, and it's obviously, or is it, no, it might be crazy. No, it's Crazy Train. I'm sorry. I don't know. It's pretty straightforward. Crazy Train has an interesting line because, yeah, you hear the dun, 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 but when it goes into the words, the verse part, his bass is kind of like almost a melody line and something I'll be talking about in my next
Oh
few
yeah,
picks.
it really is. And again, these are the reasons why I say he's really underrated, because I think a lot of this stuff really gets overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that was your number five. So my number five, you knew he had to come up at some point, or maybe not. Gene Simmons from Kiss.
Okay.
I would think if you think that Bob Daisley's underrated, I think Gene is even more underrated because in the circles of metal and hard rock, Bob Daisley got around. Okay, I mean he's played bass for countless things. Session. Even though it says you look at his thing. He was a session and guest appearance on a ton of stuff, and he's probably did more than what's on this list, right? Because there's a lot of those compilations that where they send the tapes to all these different musicians and they end up the name that shows up is the lead singer, but the band is like 10 different musicians and they're all like super famous. And so Gene Simmons, to me, because he was only in Kiss, he never really played anywhere else and never did favors for anybody and played on anybody's albums. um, Lends himself to being, even less known in the circles of rock because he never went out there. I mean, obviously everyone knows who he is, face paint and big tongue, but he didn't go and play and guest appear on an album, you know. So when you think of it that way, to me, he's more underrated than a guy like Bob Daisley. But one thing, obviously Paul Stanley shared the stage with him every night, and Paul Stanley, we all know throughout the years, has made countless mistakes on stage, right? But Paul Stanley paid um, Gene a very high compliment, saying that throughout all his years, he's never heard Gene hit a bad note. And then recently, apparently, Jimmy Page paid Gene Simmons a compliment about his bass playing, that Gene Simmons was basically left with his jaw on the ground. So that tells you something right there about his playing. He's about as steady as it gets. But what I like about Gene is that Gene doesn't play bass to be the foundation of the rhythm. He doesn't play along with the drummer, although he does. Gene plays like Paul McCartney because that's one of his biggest influences. Paul McCartney didn't play bass to be part of the rhythm section with Ringo Starr. Paul played bass so he could be the third guitar player in the Beatles. And that's the way Gene plays guitar. I mean, listen to songs like Do You Love Me? Listen to songs like Detroit Rock City. Uh, just countless songs from the early days of Kiss where this bass line is not just your bass line that goes along with the drums. It is a separate melody. And it like the one for Detroit Rock City is probably the one that stands out the most. It just cuts through because he plays with a pick. The sound cuts through. It's recorded really well. And I mean the guitars are hitting open chords, and then you hear Gene Simmons, playing, you know, bam, 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 bam. I mean, he's the one who's driving that rhythm, of course, because that's part of the rhythm section, but it's also a melody line. So that's what Gene is great at. Um, and so Gene was one of the first people to inspire me to play bass, because I never thought I could play guitar. So I said, let me try and play bass. And that's why I play bass not as bad as I do because he's not the reason why I play bass badly. He's that's my fault. He's the reason I play bass.
He's
Him
the
and Steve
reason
Harris.
I play bass badly.
Badly.
Thanks a lot, Gene.
Him and Steve Harris are the reason why I play bass.
Very cool.
So that's my number 5.
All right. Well, Gene didn't make my list, but I have a lot of respect for
fucking
Kiss.
dare you.
I have a lot of respect for Kiss for being complete sellouts. No, I'm just no, I've really come to appreciate Kiss really since we started doing this show. And we have a couple episodes we did our worst to first and among other things. So definitely check those out. Like I've said before, I've really come to enjoy some of the stuff with Kiss. I'm not as big of a Gene fan as you. I think I'm a bigger Ace and Paul fan, but we all
stop lying. You're a Peter fan. You've told me at work.
right. I'm gonna come in with a cat man shirt one day with it, with his original makeup from not his original makeup, but the music from the makeup from the first album, the really bad one that just doesn't look like anything else ever.
Terrible. I'm looking at it now. Funny thing is, I got 3 different versions of the first album on my walls that are not even the album version.
Oh man. All right, so my number 4 is going to be Geddy Lee. Geddy Lee, I think, is one of those bassists that sometimes you don't realize just how good he is because he's the front man of the band. And, part of a 3-part band is, or a 3-piece band, I should say. It's a different, experience than anything else. Rush is one of those bands that I think a lot of people either just love or hate. And, but they have a massive, massive fan base and amazing songwriting, amazing intricacy in their playing, and that applies to all 3 members. And I'm talking about, of course, the classic lineup of Rush. We all know that they didn't start with, Neil Peart. John Rutsey was in the band for the first album, and there's been other members of the band that kind of like came in and went at the very beginning. But when it comes to Rush, I think most people think of Neil Peart and that era of the band, especially since Neil was the primary songwriter. And I'm sure we'll probably talk about him on our drum episode, but we'll decide that when we get there. But as far as Geddy, Geddy is one of those guys that, like, I guess kind of changes my perception of what a bassist is. He is the front man, the singer, and plays the bass in such a different way that it's not just a bass line. It is part of the melody. It's part of the harmony. It's part of, the rhythm section. Like, whatever it needs to adapt to be part of the song, that's the way he plays it. And if I'm thinking of who musically might be the weak link of the band, it might be Geddy of the 3.
That's crazy. It's crazy to think that.
And that's what's crazy, because he's my number 4 on this list, right? So he's that high up there. And if you think of, like, musically who's the weakest link, it might be him. It might not be. But I have a massive amount of respect for Geddy. They have built at Rush is being the topic obviously there. They've built a massive fan base across the country, and I think even now, across the country, across the world, and even now, new listeners are finding Rush here and there, and they've come to prominence back when they hit. What was that movie with the Paul Rudd and what was it? I Love You Man.
Yeah, I Love You Man.
I Love You Man brought them back to kind of prominence once again, like put them in the public eye because it was a central focus of the movie was their shared love of Rush. And it kind of reminded me of some of my love for Rush too. So if you haven't seen that movie, I think it's definitely worth a watch. But staying on subject, Geddy Lee, just like kind of a lot of the things that you said about the way Gene Simmons is part of the band. I think a lot of things that you mentioned apply with Geddy too. You know, he fits the role that he needs to within the music and can do anything.
What's crazy about Geddy Lee is that don't forget he's not just their bass player and lead singer; he's also their keyboard player.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the best examples of what Geddy does is on Tom Sawyer. I
Oh yeah.
mean, the main, right after that, the second verse, and they go into like their guitar solo jam, whatever you want to call it. He's playing that keyboard part, right? And then all of a sudden it goes into guitar solo, and he's playing that same exact line he was playing on keyboard. Now he's playing on the bass,
On the bass, yeah.
and that's wickedly insane how good that is, and all the time in the background, freaking Neil Pearce just banging away at those drums, man. That, and I forgot what's that song is considered one the most air drum song in the world. But there's another song I forgot, but that also I air drum to all the time. It's just crazy, that bass line and that keyboard line. I love Geddy. I didn't put Geddy on my list. Spoiler alert, because we only got 3 left or 4 left. Because I think the other 4 I have is pretty damn important too.
Okay.
All right, so my number 4. You know him by one name. That's it, Lemmy. Important in every sense of the word. Lemmy's important to heavy metal. Not just because he lived, breathed, and died heavy metal every single day of his life. He was the embodiment of that term. He's just amazing. And to his dying day, I mean, when you see that last year when he was playing, I mean, he's giving it everything he has. And it may not be the best, but he's out there trying. He was living his life, and that he was going to die on stage if he had to. But he was amazing. What I didn't like about Motorhead when I was younger is kind of like sort of what I like about Motorhead now, is that they didn't give a shit what they sounded like. They purposely sounded distorted, and they just wrote cool songs, and Lemmy, he's songwriter, lyricist, he was the leader of that band, no doubt, because as soon as he passed away, that band was done, so
Yeah, could you even imagine?
no, there's just
Right.
there's no one that can replace that dude. There's no one that can even stand in for that guy. It is Lemmy is so one of a kind that it's you can't even. There's nothing that you can do to duplicate him whatsoever, or even replicate him. It's impossible. I mean, Metallica did that little what they call a Motorhead EP, back in the during the Load era, and even with James's raspy vocals, he still couldn't come close to even replicating anything that Lemmy did. Now, Jason did a pretty good job of replicating Lemmy's bass lines as far as sound was concerned, because it's a distorted bass. I mean, unlike most everyone else who plays bass with a clean, clear sound, Lemmy played distorted. I mean, he put a distortion box on, cranked it up, and that was his sound and his tone and his signature Rickenbacker bass. Yeah, Lemmy was one of a kind, and he's important for beyond being a bass player because he was a damn good bass player too.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so what's your number 3?
My number 3 is Cliff Burton. Cliff had a relatively short life, died at 24. Only had 3 albums with Metallica, but some people say those are the only 3 albums that matter.
Who are those people? I need to question them.
You're gonna waste a lot of time. But I mean, Cliff was one of the reasons I got into metal. I mean, I'm born in '86. He died not long after I was born. But I mean, I got into Metallica. A lot of people get into Metallica as kind of like a transition band. That leads you into the metal genre that you desire, right? But they're a great entry point for any fan of metal. And obviously, those first 3 albums have magic on them. They just do, especially Master of Puppets, and that's really where they found their groove with Cliff's writing and influence in the band. And unfortunately, it'll serve as a testament to like his last testament, right? And so I think so many people especially getting into the metal scene, find these albums that are a huge influence, and even the most jaded fan can look at it, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, or all 3 of them, whatever, and say like they're just absolutely amazing albums. And a big part of that was the way that Cliff influenced the band and with things like Orion and just his style of bass line. Um, you know, kind of pushing the elements of like what they're putting onto record, and it's one of those questions that we'll always ask, what could have been if he had lived longer, right? People think in their whole thing, like, where would Metallica be now if Cliff Burton was still alive? Who knows? And it's just one of those questions we'll never get an answer to. But you know, some of the guys we're talking about on this list, he cited as an influence, but how many musicians now would say that Cliff influenced them to get into playing? And I think that's one of those lasting, unfortunate testaments to a guy that died way too young.
Way, way too young. I love Cliff. Um, I don't have a lot to say about Cliff because I'm going to say something in a little bit. So, um, yes, Cliff was crazy good, and I'll say more about him in a little bit. So Cliff was your number 3. That means that I have a different number 3. My number 3 is Geezer Butler
Okay.
from Black Sabbath, if you didn't know.
I've never heard of this man.
Who? What?
Who is this elderly man you speak of?
Oh man, that's an insult.
And why is he buttling people?
It's better than diddling. Oh my god.
Geezer Diddler.
Nice. He did who? He diddler. All right. Gene. Geezer Butler, bassist for Black Sabbath. All right, so very similar to Gene Simmons and very similar to what you were saying about Geddy Lee. Geezer also is one of those people who plays a melody line rather than just a standard rhythmic bass line. The songs that stand out for me in those kinds of terms: War Pigs, NIB, Evil Woman, Don't You Play Your Games With Me. That's the actual full title of the song, which is a cover song. And The Wizard and Sweet Leaf. Geezer, beyond the fact that he was a bass player for Black Sabbath and he was a very good bass player for Black Sabbath, he was also the lyricist for Black Sabbath up until Ronnie James Dio joined the band, and then when Ozzy came back, I believe they did 2 songs on the reunion album, and then the 13, obviously Geezer was incorporated to help write lyrics again. Uh, Geezer's just freaking cool as shit. I mean, plays with his fingers. He has been considered an influence on so many people in the genre. Just by his playing, the style that he plays. I mean, if you want to put it that way, he's like, he's the Paul McCartney of metal bassists, because that's the way he plays. Him and Gene and Geddy, the three most recognizable that play melody lines and harmony lines rather than just standard rhythm. And when I try to air pluck or air bass, to Black Sabbath songs, yeah, and NIB is pretty cool, but man, War Pigs is hard. So that's an unusual song. So Geezer's had so much influence just all the way down the line. I mean, he had a rough time when Dio joined the band and he was going through some personal issues. He left for a little bit during the recording sessions and then came back and did his bass parts. And what an amazing job he did, because I believe his bass parts were already recorded and then they re-recorded them with him playing. So, Geezer, he came in and he was part of the Heaven and Hell sessions, and then he ended up leaving, and the band recruited Craig Gruber, who rehearsed with the band, had some sort of involvement on the album, but then as he it was looking like he wasn't that Geezer wasn't going to be part of the album, so Craig recorded the songs, and then Geezer came back, and so they gave Craig a very big sum of money to go away, basically, and the funny thing is, say what?
I need that.
I know, right? So then Geezer came back, and without even listening to what Craig had to do, he re-recorded the bass tracks and just did his own thing, And so that's pretty cool. That probably the similar thing that Steve did with not Testament, with Megadeth when he replaced Jeff when he replaced Dave Ellefson's bass tracks. Probably didn't even listen to Dave's bass tracks.
It's possible we'll never know. Well, I can't say we'll never know. We might know at some point. Who knows?
Who knows? But anyway, so yeah, Geezer Butler's my number 3.
Well, he's my number 2. Pretty much all the reasons you said just now. The guy is. I love watching him in interviews because he just sounds like he does not want to be there. And
it's just an English thing.
There's something about him. He's just like too cool for school, and not in a way that's disrespectful. He's just like, I'm nothing special. I'm just a guy who plays bass, and I enjoy playing bass. And why are you asking me questions? And that's always the vibe I've gotten from him. But that being said, I've always enjoyed every interview he's done that I've seen. I love the way he plays. His influence is obviously massive. I mean, any of those 4 guys from the original Black Sabbath lineup, that they're obviously just going to have this level of influence because they're the genesis of metal. And Geezer, to me, there's no weak link in the original lineup of Black Sabbath. There's just not. All 4 of them are, major players in that band. And Geezer has done other projects. He did GZR. He did, other stuff. He played with Ozzy on Osmosis, right? He played Heaven and Hell, obviously a takeoff of that Dio era of the band. But I mean, he's almost entirely synonymous with Black Sabbath and Black Sabbath members. Um, so, um, you know, it's interesting to see that because a lot of the guys we're talking about have played on a ton of ton of different projects. They're musicians. Well, Geezer's just Geezer, and just always gonna have or be intrinsically tied to that Black Sabbath um, scene.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's cool about Geezer, I think, he was a very close friend of Ozzy's for many, many, many years, and still pretty much is. Although, you know, I maybe it's the way English people are with each other, but you know, Geezer says Ozzy doesn't call. Ozzy says Geezer doesn't call. Geezer says he does call. Ozzy says he does call. It's like,
Something
they're just
like
kind of
that.
like they're just like old men fighting, right? And Geezer played for Ozzy, in Ozzy's band for a short period of time. Was actually featured on the EP Ozzy Live. Geezer was the touring bass player. So they've, like you said, they're intrinsically connected for basically the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
So my number 2 was your number 3, which was Cliff Burton. Um, so there's some interesting things, and I got to say this: I'm a huge fan of Metallica. Understatement, but
Really?
I did not realize I had done something wrong when it came to their timeline. And when I think about it now, it makes it even more amazing that this happened in this way. I have a CD here that says Cliff's first show, right? And I, I've listened to it. It's the first time that they obviously played Anesthesia Pulling Teeth. It says here on the front cover, recorded live at the Stone in San Francisco on March 5th, 1982. However, that's wrong. It was March 5th, 1983.
Bum bum bum.
Think about that. Cliff joined in March of 83. Within a month, they drove to New York. 5 weeks later, after he joined, they fire Dave Mustaine and hire Kirk Hammett. So a lot of shit. I never put this together. A lot of shit happened within a 6-week period of time for Metallica.
Very short amount of time. All those changes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I because for the life of me, and maybe just I haven't done enough reading, but for the life of me, I could have swore Cliff had joined in '82, and it kind of goes back to how Lars downplays Dave's involvement in Metallica because Dave says, "Oh, I was in Metallica for 2 years," well, he wasn't, and Lars downplays that he was in the band for 7-9 months. He was obviously in there a little bit longer than that. But even then, it wasn't. I think if it was 11 months or 13 months, the most that Dave was involved. Mustaine. It's just weird. So Cliff, I was just surprised to realize that Cliff had only been in the band for a month before they went to New York, and they recorded Kill 'Em All. The reason why I came across this was because, again, when we were talking about the whole Dave Mustaine, Kirk Hammett thing in the lead guitarist thing, I was trying to put the timeline together, and then on top of it, I was trying to sit there and say, okay, which lead guitar solo is Dave's, which lead guitar solo is Kirk's in comparison. And Kirk had an honest answer. He was thrown into the situation. He had very little time to learn the songs. And so he basically played off of what Dave had already done. So that's part of why Dave claims that he stole his solos. And that's part of why a lot of the solos sound like it was done by Dave. That neither here nor there. We're here to talk about Cliff Burton. Cliff's influence on all of that, the band, he joins the band and they instantly record or instantly start playing the song, Anesthesia Pulling Teeth, and then they start playing Whiplash. That combination stayed together for a while. Cliff Burton brought, you mentioned it, just the songwriting style and the things that he did for them transformed Metallica. He brought with him song structure. He brought with him a change in attitude that would then change James's way of thinking to create more mature lyrics. And again, he was another one of those bass players that played like lead bass. Perfect example, Orion, For Whom the Bell Tolls, Anesthesia. Those songs stand out as those kind of lead bass type songs. You pose the question, where would Metallica be today without Cliff Burton? Or where was it the other way around?
The other way around.
Yeah.
Where would it be if he was still around?
It was still around. So I look at it both ways. Where would Metallica be without Cliff Burton? And then you say, where would Metallica be if they still had Cliff Burton? Mm-hmm. And it's a really interesting and complex set of questions because I believe they're not the same band. I believe
they're not. So what would they be as successful as they are?
I would sit there and say they'd probably be on a Testament Slayer level. Maybe not even as big as Slayer if Cliff doesn't join the band. And then, so he joins the band. So what happens if he stays? Well, the thing about Cliff, which was pretty much in tune with what Metallica is kind of today, is he wasn't just a metal guy. He liked, Lynyrd Skynyrd. He liked classical music. He liked things that weren't just metal. So, and that right there in and of itself influenced the other guys differently as well. So yeah, where would they be with him? Where would they be without him? Kind of interesting and complex set of questions. Cliff Burton, amazing bass player. I miss him, just like James talks about. He misses him to this day. I have a picture of Cliff on my wall that hangs over my Metallica clock in my office, and I see Cliff pretty much all the time. There's a picture of the band in front of me that has Cliff and Lars and James and Kirk at the front of the stage, just sitting down, hanging out. I see Cliff all the time when I'm in my office. So he's always there. That's my number 2. I think your number 1 is the same as my number 1. I'm gonna guess.
Probably. I would take a wild guess. I could make a joke here, but instead I will just say Steve Harris is my number 1.
As is mine.
Steve Harris, I think, obviously the heart and soul of Iron Maiden. Original member, writes the majority of their music. Super influential with his style of playing, his gallop, that is synonymous with metal, and countless other accolades that this man has. Still looks young for his age at 68 years old, running across the stage, still very athletic, and it's very impressive to see. I've seen Iron Maiden a couple times, and we're going to go see them again this year, and I'm really excited about that. But specifically, Steve Harris, I mean, you talk about players that influence the style and the desire to play bass. That would be Steve Harris. That early scene of metal, I watched. I wasn't around then, so I didn't get to see a lot of this stuff really. By the time I was, even a competent human being, that was really like the end of the Bruce era and the beginning of the Blaze era of the band. But, obviously we have records. Go back and listen to all these things and, you know, listening to, or watching videos of, people going to clubs in the early days of Maiden, bringing, cardboard bases and, stuff cut out of wood just so they could, play along, strum along, whatever. And it's something that is amazing to see, and I think if you're part of the younger generation, you probably have missed it. Especially the younger generation that didn't grow up with MTV or VH1 Classic or things like that, where you can go back and watch a lot of this stuff. Obviously, it's available, but we have so much available today that it's difficult to discern and parse through all the information that's out there. But if you're listening to the show, you're a metal fan, and you probably either like or listened to Iron Maiden at some point, or at least have some level of respect for them, even if you don't like them.
God, I would hope
But
they've listened to Maiden.
yeah, well, we can't account for everyone's taste, but um, you know, obviously both of us are massive Maiden fans, and a big part of that is, Steve Harris, his writing, his ability to play, his style, his influence, and his continued energy. And yeah, that makes him number one for me.
Well, what possibly hasn't been said about Harry? Because I mean, the accolades have been endless since they've rose to fame in the early '80s. Um, like you said, the Gallop, the epic songs that he writes, the sound, the words that he creates. I mean, he's not just uh, a bass player. He is the boss of Iron Maiden. That's his band. He was hell bent on making it, and he did, and it's his band. But more so than anything, it's his band, but it's still six guys now that share a love of doing what they do. And one of the things that I find amazing about Iron Maiden in general is the fact that it's one of the few bands out there that I know of that where anybody in the band can write a song and anybody in the band can bring a song to the other members and say, I have this song and I want to play it. And they're all open to the idea. And usually, if the idea is good, it'll get played. I mean, very few bands will have songwriters, or Steve is the only songwriter, but then, uh, Bruce and Adrian are the sole songwriter of a different song, and Steve has nothing to do with it. That's very rare.
True. Yeah.
Usually, like Kirk from Metallica brings an idea, but Lars and James will have their influence. You know, Lars will automatically get credit because he's going to be the guy who takes that riff that Kurt brought and he's going to incorporate it into another riff that James has. And so it's always going to be, Hetfield, Ulrich, and whoever else, where Iron Maiden, Steve Harris might sit there and say, here, I got a song. It's going to be about 14 minutes long and you got to read all 1,000 words that is part of the lyrics, a la Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And but then you'll turn around and you'll get a song like Flash of the Blade or The Duelist that are written strictly by Bruce Dickinson and or Adrian Smith, and that's it. It's just two different things. Or you'll get Dave Murray, who'll throw in his one song per album, and he'll get credit. He might co-write that with Steve Harris. He might co-write that with Bruce Dickinson. I mean, it's amazing how they work. Steve, as much of a boss as he is hell bent on being great, the band being great, and them bringing something to the fans. I can say this, the only negative I can say about, Steve is hell bent on bringing music to the fans is that they don't necessarily bring the best sounding recording to the masses, but they do bring their best effort in terms of songs.
I would agree with that. I mean, especially in the last, few years. Um, I say few years, the last few albums, I guess. Ever since they started recording in their own studio, I don't think they sound as good. I think everything past Dance of Death has some issues with at least the recording. Um, and whether it's your taste and style of music or like writing or not, that's another matter. But specifically, like from a production standpoint, they just don't sound as good today. Um, that being said, like Senjutsu, I think sounded really damn good, and it was certainly a step up from the last few albums, and I'm excited to see where they go next. I mean, I'm just glad they're around, still doing their thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to put a bow on this with Steve Harris, um, like I said, he was one of him and Gene Simmons were the ones that inspired me to pick up a bass guitar and play. I have never been as good as Steve Harris. I've never learned an Iron Maiden song. I never learned a lot of songs. Period. I didn't play bass for very long, but I mostly did original music more than play covers. So that's interesting in and of itself. Um, but he was the guy who basically made me want to pick up a bass, and it is absolutely amazing what he has done over the years. I'm always in awe of listening to his bass lines and listening to how his bass line cuts through every song. And even now, you listen to it, they got 6 guys, they got 3 guitar players, and you can still hear his bass line cut through all 3 guitars, which I find incredible. I mean, I I bow to Kevin Shirley for being able to put those mixes together, because that's got to be hard as hell, you know. So, especially when you have someone like Steve who's very influential in how his bass sounds and how it comes across on the record.
Yeah, I mean he wants his sound how he wants it, and that's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because I mean, how many musicians do we know that are like that?
Oh yeah, my favorite bands. They're like that. All right. Well, that is our top 10 most important bassists in metal history. You can agree with me, you can agree with Chris, or you can disagree with both of us. It doesn't matter. Let us know in the comments. Okay. That brings an end to this episode of Debating Metal. So remember, you can listen to us just about every week on your favorite podcast platform. And if you want to see us continue to grow, tell your friends and family about us and have them like, subscribe, download, or follow as well.
And don't forget, you can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. YouTube viewers, click subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post a new show. So remember to tune in to the next episode, where we'll talk about the 10 most important drummers in heavy metal history. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.